right,
and Wall Street.
we as African Americans, we were promised if we fought in that war that we would obtain not only our liberty, but 40 acres and a mule.
Never happened.
Okay, that means that not only were we going to be free, but we was going to be given the ability to maintain ourselves, to take care of ourselves, land to grow our own food, a mule in which to work the land. Because we did not get it, although we won the victory, once we had obtained the victory, they kicked us to the curb and said, now you're free. Go on about your business. And the majority of us got turned right back into slavery. And from that day to this, we've been begging and marching and protesting for all the rights and civil liberties that America's foreigners killed themselves to come over here and enjoy. And we are still fighting for it.
All right.
Greetings, Janet Chavis here. Let's talk about Juneteenth, which was just made a federal holiday by Joe Biden. Juneteenth, which is also known as Jubilee Day, Freedom Day, and Emancipation Day, is a holiday celebrating the emancipation of enslaved people in the United States. But the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863 and wasn't enforced in the South until 2 years later, at the end of the Civil War in 1865. That's 250,000 slaves in the South who were never told they were free until Union soldiers brought the news to them in Galveston, Texas. 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed and 2 months after the Civil War had ended. It has been celebrated by Blacks in Galveston, Texas ever since, even spreading to other states as the real date in which all Blacks were made free. But then enters Opal Lee, a 94-year-old activist from Fort Worth, Texas, who's referred to as the grandmother of Juneteenth. She began yearly walks to Texas, to DC, wanting to see the day recognized as a federal holiday and wanting to correct the date on which all Blacks were actually made free. So she began at the end of the Obama administration and continued until just recently when it was signed by Joe Biden as a federal law. Since 2016, she would walk 2.5 miles, signifying the 2.5 years Blacks were not told they were free. And she'd walk from her church with the pastor, county commissioner, and others, and the next day start where she left off, walking a 2.5 mile stretch in different cities until reaching DC. It wasn't a walk from Texas direct to DC, but a walk of patience and determination nonetheless. My beef is we are sugarcoating the history. The same history Joe Biden pretends needs to be addressed. And it's the history of racism in this country and the slavery which justified it underneath the premise of white supremacy. The signing of a federal holiday acknowledging the day all Blacks were properly informed bears witness against this country, who allowed 250,000 Blacks to remain slaves after their brothers had fought and won the war. That's 2 whole years. And were it not for the fact the war had ended, those Union soldiers would have never arrived to tell them. But white owners knew they had lost the war, yet kept them as slaves. And even after being told that they were now free, nothing by which to sustain themselves and family had been given, and thousands died as a result of sickness and disease. So where's the promise of 40 acres and a mule that went along with that freedom? Because it was based on the promise of freedom that the men enlisted in the war. And 40 acres and a mule was intended to sustain themselves and their families, land to grow their food, and a mule in which to work the land. The United States has reneged on their promise and instead paid slave owners who were forced to do without their slaves reparations. So I'm not sure what we're celebrating that was just made a federal holiday. Late notification, Freedom to die of disease and sickness, or freedom to exist as a second-class citizen? Maybe it's your own federal holiday you signed into law, commemorating how Blacks were deceived into fighting your battles by promising what you never intended to give. I'm not celebrating Juneteenth as a day Blacks were declared free, but as a reminder of how this country dealt with our people who were kicked to the curb after they got the job done for which they had enlisted. And right now, today, Republicans and Democrats who had no problem making this a federal holiday, proclaiming equality as the reason, have reviewed over 400 different bills intended to reduce Blacks to nothing more than a slave by stripping of their involvement in government by means of their vote. And Blacks who use their vote solely to get a man out of office, placing no demand on the vote given to Biden, are still waiting for him to act on their behalf. For they were told to wait until he gets into office and to maintain their focus on getting Trump out. Well, now he's out and Biden's in, and nothing tangible has been given to African Americans. But if you ask them, a historic event has occurred, a holiday, remembering the day they forgot to tell Blacks they were free. If I were a white racist whose ancestors fought dearly to keep and maintain slaves, I'd view it as my holiday and a demonstration of the will of my ancestors to keep slaves, regardless to what had been promised. It would assure me that no matter what is said or done, the objectives remain unchanged. And that is precisely the confirmation that white racists in this country need after nationwide protests and demands to be rid of police, the original slave catchers who aided in apprehending and keeping a slave on a plantation. It's one of the reasons Trump was so popular, because he promised to make America great again and gave carte blanche approval to police to do whatever they feel needed to be done. So you saw them at the insurrection in Washington, aiding and assisting, not stopping and preventing. They removed barriers, permitting a stampede of people to simply rush in. They and Trump were fighting for an America her bread was buttered on, spread out by the lives of African Americans who were their slaves. But today, we celebrate and allow the sugarcoating of truth, because any shred of hope available that we are part of America, just as valued and respected as all others we cleave to, unwilling to deal with the reality set before us. It's a reality that shall indeed deal with us, and already we are seeing it, deliberately choosing not to. I long for the day when Black folks instantly call out bullshit from politicians who pretend to be of service to our people. Please tell me our holiday is needed to celebrate something that never took place, the liberation of our people. They are continuously pouring sugar over shit to keep you in denial about your status here in America. Slave. And you lap it up like dogs and celebrate what you ought to resent. Did it ever occur to you that 250,000 Blacks were left in slavery after thousands had given their lives to free us? Did it ever occur to you the slave masters knew they were free and not a damn thing was done to release them? For 2 whole years after the Emancipation Proclamation, they were kept as slaves. And it was 2 months after the war had ended before they were even told. So whose holiday is it that was made federal? Because if you ask me, they have more to celebrate than we do. This is not a time to celebrate the freeing of our people. It's a time when Blacks were lied to and promised freedom for fighting in a civil war. It's a time when 40 acres and a mule were promised but not received. It's a time when 250,000 were left in slavery without the courtesy of announcing they were free like all the others. And when told, turned out into the streets with nothing and thousands died of disease, death, and starvation. If you could leave the South, you went up north. And if you couldn't, you volunteered to be a slave so that at least you could eat and possibly feed your family, who no doubt had to volunteer their services as a slave as well. Sometimes the history of our people is staring us right in the face and we don't know what we're seeing. We'll even call it good, a blessing, a good deed for us, much like this signing of this federal holiday, where it looks like something being done for us, but it serves them more. I'll never forget as a child how I used to love to go down south, kick off my shoes, and walk barefooted in the dirt. It was fun to me because in the city, you never got to touch the earth and be with nature. We lived in a concrete building known as the projects, so being allowed to roam around in the dirt in my bare feet was a pleasure to me. I could get as dirty as I wanted to. It didn't matter. It didn't matter if my hair was curled all nice and pretty. It didn't matter the kind of clothes I had on. These are all the things that mattered when you live in the city. My cousins were poor, dirt poor, and the house they lived in belonged to a white man who collected rent because the members of this family worked in his fields. This is in my lifetime as a child. I thought the man was so nice because every morning at 5 a.m., he'd come to the house and pick everybody up for work. I volunteered because I wanted to be with my cousins. And when I learned that they were getting $27 an hour, $27 a day, that was a lot of money to me. All I had to do was jump on the back of the pickup truck when it came to get us. So I did. I dug potatoes, I primed tobacco, and had fun doing it. I didn't need to be there. It was something to do where I could make money and be with my cousins, whom I was there to visit for the summer. I'm sure it wasn't fun for them. It's just the way it was. And I thought that white man was so nice, picking us up, dropping us off. And he'd even give you a cash advance if you didn't have money at break time and take you to the store so you can buy whatever you wanted to eat and drink and carry you back out to the field to finish the day's work. When we were done, we'd be taken to some old barn somewhere where they'd pay us in cash and deduct whatever cash advance had been given. At the time, I didn't understand the situation my relatives were in. It's called sharecropping, which is only one step away from slavery itself. What was fun to me, my cousins had no choice in. The kind white man giving advances who would drive us to the store to make sure we'd get something to eat, he owned it. So he was taking us to work in his field and taking us to the store. He owned himself to spend the money he paid us. Every day he did this, lunchtime, break time. And at the end of the day, when we got off, we'd go right back to the store after being paid and load up on beer, cigarettes, and whatever else we wanted. I thought he was such a nice man. He probably was, but none of it got in the way of prioritizing his interests. For he had acres and acres of land, and his own house sat on acres of land, pristine as can be. And he managed to maintain and keep it using labor that was not only cheap in comparison to the profit being made, but returned right back to him before the first attempt was even made to sell what was produced. And throughout all of it, he was just as pleasant and cordial as Joe Biden, always with a smile, always with a kind word to say. And why not when you're winning? Why not when you're ahead of the game and nobody even knows what it is you're doing. They think you're great. They think you're absolutely wonderful, just as I did as a child. Mm-mm-mm. The lessons of our youth, they may not serve you as a child, but they will kick in later on in life. And you'll understand the ancestors were right when they said, you'll understand it better by and by. I tend to think they meant it literally, by and by. Because when you don't own property, you'll become somebody else's.